Okay, guys, thanks. We'll go ahead and get going. So today, last seminar of the series, appreciate everybody hanging in there. The goal for today's seminar was to sort of wrap up a lot of what we've talked about for environmental flows in the previous seminars. We've started off with the concepts of what are environmental flows, how do watersheds work. We've had a lot of nice discussions about different topics around California. And today I thought we'd finish up with a couple of discussions about future prospects for environmental flows in California and where we're sort of moving to the next and upcoming concepts and ideas for environmental flows in California. And so I'm happy today to introduce Ted Grantham from UC Berkeley. He's an assistant professor and also with UC Extension. Ted is going to be talking about a PPIC report that recently came out, the Public Policy Institute for California. Ted was involved with a bunch of other folks, talking about managing California's freshwater ecosystems. He's going to provide a summary of that report, which is available online. It'll be pretty brief for about maybe half the seminar time. We'll have Ted give us that overview. And then I'll wrap things up with just a 15-minute overview of the California Environmental Flows Framework, which is an effort that Ted and I and a variety of other folks from different agencies and nonprofits are working on. It's a framework for how to better think about environmental flows in California and try to provide some guidance with all the diversity of techniques that are out there and different agencies with different management opportunities, as we've talked about. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce Ted, bring him on up, and we'll get started. Thanks, Ted.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi. Yeah, so as Sarah mentioned, today I'm just going to take a little bit of time to really provide a summary of this report on managing California's freshwater ecosystems that came out of a report done by the Public Policy Institute of California. And I'm going to be channeling Jeff Mount. He really gets a lot of enjoyment out of channeling others, so I get to channel Jeff today, who is the lead author on this work. And it was really motivated by a broader project by PPIC to look at how California responded to the 2012 to 2016 drought. And this particular report focused on how the environment fared during this drought period and some of the institutional responses to the sort of ecological consequences of drought. And just to give you sort of a flash forward to the recommendations that came out of the study, they really could be grouped in these three broad categories. Basically, to do a sort of a better job at managing for freshwater ecosystems during drought and more generally. In California, we need to do a better job of accounting for our water use, our water supplies. We need to put more thought into the way we sort of prepare and anticipate drought and drought impacts. And specifically, it would be very useful for us to develop explicit ecosystem management plans that establish environmental water budgets. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So keep these sort of recommended reforms in mind. So let's look back at the drought and what the drought looked like in 2012 to 2016. One of the sort of outstanding characteristics of this drought is that we experienced both record dryness, in other words, precipitation deficits, and record warmth. So much temperatures that were much above average. And so here you just see the time series, annual time series since 1950. And associated with this very dry conditions and very sort of water deficit conditions, we saw very high record low flows in many of our stream gauges. So this was a nice graphic that illustrates that. It basically shows the proportion of gauges, stream flow gauges in the state, that registered very low conditions, either flows that for that period of time were under the 10th percentile of the period of record, or gauges in this purple line that showed record low flows for the period of record for that system. So we saw for many of our rivers being the lowest flows that had ever been seen before during this period of time. So what did this mean for ecosystems and ecosystem response and institutional responses? So broadly speaking, we saw institutions sort of dealing with the environmental or ecosystem impacts of this drought in very uneven and ad hoc ways. In other words, many of the sort of institutions and water districts were not prepared to deal with the consequences, the environmental consequences of drought. Of course, it was very controversial, in part because there was so little preparedness to deal with drought impacts. And what we saw in many watersheds is that environmental flow standards, so those environmental water criteria or standards that were established were often relaxed. This was done in some cases through these temporary use change permits filed with the State Water Board. And we also saw that some water users were in fact subject to curtailments, but these were generally done to protect senior water right holders, not necessarily to protect the environment. So in this study, the way that we decided to explore responses, institutional responses to drought, was through a case study approach. And so we looked at these 8 different watersheds or systems in the state and kind of a deep dive on how the water managers and institutions and the public responded to environmental management problems during the drought period. And I won't summarize all of the findings, but just want to give you a few examples from a subset of these case study basins. So in the Trinity River, I believe you learned, for those of you who attended last week's talk, we learned a little bit about the Trinity River Restoration Program. And what we saw there is having that program in place, that institutional structure in place, really helped to improve the drought responses, including some critical and emergency flow releases that are thought to have saved some of the salmon runs in that system. The response wasn't perfect, but having that institutional structure really benefited the way in which they responded to the environmental impacts of drought. At Shasta Dam, in contrast, there was less sort of preparedness, and the agencies involved in Shasta Dam management and the management of downstream flows and temperatures really struggled to deal with the drought, which led to significant failures, which you may have also talked about last week. Perhaps similar to the Trinity River and the Huda Creek, right here in our backyard, that system also did benefit from having these negotiated environmental flows in place that were established into the Huda Accord over a decade ago. And so there's some themes sort of emerging here. For the Delta, this was an example of where these temporary use change permits that can be filed with the board to change the terms of water agreements really resulted in weakened protections, particularly for fish populations, basically relaxing the flow standards through the Delta in order to satisfy other water users. The Russian River was also a unique example here. The Russian River water users were subject to an information order by the board to get a better handle on water use. And so for that system, there was a big effort just to collect basic data on the water users in the basin, who was using water, how much they were using, when they were using. So this very, what we consider to be pretty basic and essential information about these systems was poorly known, which really sort of delayed drought responses and really intensified some of the impacts to the streams in that river basin. So kind of circling back to some of the lessons learned broadly from these case study analyses. So first, just broadly speaking, we need to do in California a better job about accounting for environmental waters, I should say, and specifically strengthen systems of water use reporting and even just essential water availability monitoring. And this has been a sort of a general theme in California water, not just in the environmental sector, that we generally could improve the way in which we track and account for water use and water supplies. And coupled with this, particularly within the environment, we don't do a very good job of sort of collecting our biological or environmental data in a sort of a coordinated fashion that allows for the type of responses that are often needed during drought. And just one example of an analysis that was done along these lines was a sort of a deep dive into delta flow outflow patterns during the drought. And one of the things that you hear often in California water is that fish are sort of taking taking the water of farmers, and that the environment is really a sort of a major constraint to delta exports. And so for those of you familiar with the delta, just walk you through it quickly here. Most of the delta inflows come from the Sacramento, you see coming down from the north, a much smaller fraction from the San Joaquin River. And these numbers here show the average inflows and outflows during the 2012 to 2016 drought period. And so of those outflows, most of those outflows are either what they consider uncaptured water, so that 30% water that's like physically during the winter time, or due to the sort of the capacity of the diversion structures, cannot physically be captured. 52% of that outflow is what they call system water, which are water that's being sent through the delta in order to maintain adequate water quality conditions for in delta uses. And then a much smaller fraction of that is ecosystem water. So this is over the 5-year period. Ecosystem water comprised a relatively small proportion of delta outflows, and during the worst drought year in 2015, ecosystem water only accounted for about 10% of outflows. So this notion that ecosystem water, is really the primary factor restricting exports is not borne out in the data that were presented here. So a second key recommendation that came from this report was the need broadly for better drought planning, and there were some examples of river basins that did have drought plans in place that generally fared better in terms of the environmental outcomes and in terms of the sort of the conflict that characterized those river basins. And so examples of this are the Yuba River Basin, which has a pretty well established management system in place where water allocations actually vary depending on the water year type, and they sort of move into these different management regimes depending on how much water is available. And that's one example of a fairly successful basin that managed to get through the drought without too many impacts on either water users or the environment, and rebounded quite quickly after the drought. So just generally speaking, it's important for watersheds and for these river basins to develop, drought management plans or water management plans that anticipate the effects of drought and anticipate the actions that are needed to mitigate sort of negative impacts. And of course, during drought, during periods of water scarcity, there are inevitably difficult decisions that need to be made. There are trade-offs inevitable, and it's important that those trade-offs are explicitly acknowledged, and the earlier that's done, sort of ideally before the drought, that will serve decision makers well into the future. And going through the somewhat sort of painful process of setting priorities and making those priorities explicit, I think has tremendous value. So those are all part of this broader lesson of better drought planning. So the last recommendation that kind of fits into this broader theme of environmental flows and environmental water that's been the subject of this seminar is the need to establish ecosystem water budgets. And by this I mean a fixed or flexible volume of water that's explicitly reserved for environmental purposes. And these ecosystem water budgets can, in theory, vary by water year and vary by location, but they should be, well defined. And furthermore, this report recommends that we actually establish these environmental water allocations as priority, or effectively as priority water rights. In other words, we determine how much the environment is going to be allocated. That water is considered highest priority, cannot be diverted by other appropriators. But it can be managed in a flexible way, and we make the further recommendations, and you'll hear about in Sarah's talk, that sort of the best way we can actually manage these volumes of water is in what we consider sort of this functional flow context, where we can provide water allocations or promote the allocation of environmental water in ways that helps to preserve or restore ecosystem functions. And let me give you a couple examples of what that looks like. So here we see sort of a general diagram of what an altered versus a more natural flow regime might look like. So the natural flow regime is shown in sort of orange here, whereas the what would be sort of a typical regulated river downstream of a large dam is shown in green, where you would, under a regulated regime, you might have lower winter flows, generally higher or augmented flows moving into the dry season, the dry summer season, and then generally speaking, much more depressed, sort of late fall, early winter flows relative to natural conditions. And of course, you also see much less natural variation in the flow regime. So given that these our dams and our water infrastructures operated in this way, what would how might we use ecosystem water to preserve sort of desirable ecosystem features, either particular species or the habitats that those species rely upon? And the idea that is being promoted is based on work that Sarah was very much involved with and leading, and what we consider to call, what we're referring to as a functional flows approach. And the idea here is that we take this unimpaired or this sort of modified flow regime and add, we don't try to sort of restore the full natural hydrograph, because that would, frankly, take too much water. But by adding water at critical times of year to restore functions that are associated with really important ecological processes, we can get better ecological outcomes. And so the four sort of components of these functional flow regimes that you'll hear more about in a second are the fall, this initial fall flush, which stimulates kind of re-wets riverbeds and stimulates a lot of ecological processes. In some cases, stimulates migration. The flood pulse period, which is high winter flows, which are really important for activating floodplains and creating sort of stimulating geomorphic processes that rearrange habitats and move sediment. The spring snowmelt recession period is shown to be very important for all sorts of ecological processes, including riparian vegetation recruitment and frog reproduction and other native species here in California. And in this case, although this is very much an artificial feature, it's an important thing to note here that in many of our systems, such as Shasta, we may actually be very interested in these fall releases to maintain low flow temperature conditions. So that's just included here to say that we're not, in some cases, we might actually be creating flow regimes that bear little resemblance to the natural flow regime, but this is really guided by our ecosystem objectives. And in this case, if we're trying to restore and maintain salmon populations, in some cases, we may be releasing more water that would naturally occur in the system in order to provide the habitat conditions that they need to thrive. So how feasible is it to implement these recommendations? You can imagine some of these ideas are somewhat controversial, particularly establishing an environmental, what would be equivalent to a priority environmental water right. Nevertheless, it's actually been somewhat surprising how receptive different elements of the water, different sort of members of the water community have been to many of these ideas. It's not entirely clear if legal changes would be needed to implement some of these recommendations. They certainly might help, but they might not necessarily be required. One of the sort of the sticky issues is, I think it's generally recognized that the current our current approach for defining environmental water needs, particularly in the Endangered Species Act context, doesn't provide the flexibility that would be sort of desired. Often we're in these, we set either through negotiations or these various agreements where often, might be specific flow requirements established. And as these systems evolve and change, those water allocations might not be sort of the best way of using environmental water. And so we want more flexibility in the way that we manage environmental water. But of course, the flip side of that, we also need assurances that there will be enough water to protect some of these essential or highly valued environmental assets. I guess I'd say broadly. So how do you sort of provide assurance but also provide flexibility? I think is a challenge that we'll have to continue to grapple with. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, is how do we actually secure funding to obtain this, and manage this in ecosystem or water budget. The environment has often been referred to as a fiscal orphan in California water, and it continues to be so. There have been various ideas floated around, various public goods taxes, a way to sort of take the water. The environment is often treated as sort of an externality in many water transactions today, and can we actually sort of somehow include the value of that water for the environment in the way that we move and sort of transact water. And I don't think we've really come to a good solution on this topic as well. So everything I presented just now can be found on this report, Managing California's Ecosystems, on this website. Again, I was very much channeling Jeff Mount today, who is the lead author on this work, and want to acknowledge, of course, the other co-authors on this project. But hope you found it interesting, and I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Aaron.
Two questions, and then I'll switch.
I got here late. I may have missed it, but have you guys looked into 5937 efficient game code?
Yeah, so that's one of the many sort of legal mechanisms that can be used to secure water, particularly below dams. I think it's sort of a tool in the toolkit, and it has been used successfully in some contexts, including Buda Creek, and there's a few other examples of that working. I think it's sort of a slow process of sort of securing flows under 5937, and I guess I'll say that the Department of Fish and Wildlife has not been particularly aggressive in enforcing that requirement, and so which makes it sort of difficult to see that as being a really viable mechanism moving forward until that changes. Yeah, Jay?
I'll just point out that 18% of about 8 million acres for the Delta outflow is about 1.5 million feet. And that's about 10% of the additional groundwater pumping in the San Joaquin Valley that occurred during the drought.
10%.
So it wasn't a big, it was
1.5
million acre feet in a drought is, in that drought is probably worth $1.5 million.
It wouldn't have been a game changer.
But it's still $1.5 million zero water somewhere. And in fact, if it was water that the environment sold, you raise a lot more.
Another idea on how to raise money for the environment. Yeah.
Actually, the temporary version to change credits process, I think that freed up about 700,000 acre feet during the drought for project purposes, and had a margin rate for the drought of about 1,000 acre foot, which is not too high.
Right.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, so if they pull a little bit off the environmental allocations, yeah. Well, I mean, I would say the environment probably needed every drop of that allocation, but in a wet year. Yeah. Question is, would there have been any fish left to benefit from that account? Yeah.
I think if you were to look at, if you have the environmental water right, many cases you would want to sell it.
I think that's right. I don't know if you'd necessarily want to sell it. You may or may not want to sell it during the worst drought on record. Yeah. But you could consider it. But having that option would be great. Yeah.
They sell it to a lot of those farmers that were having trouble down south, and a lot of those things. That's not a major place of irrigation. There were the regular market price during the height of the drought south of the Delta was about $1,500 an acre. You do a lot of environmental good with that.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
We can ask more questions. Okay. All right, thanks. So building a little bit then on this idea of how to better manage moving into the future. There's a group of folks here at UC Davis, folks at Berkeley, Nature Conservancy, a couple NGOs, CalTrout, USGS, SPORT, Southern California Water Research Project, a lot of folks you've actually heard from during this seminar have sort of come together to have come together to better help provide guidance and integrate a lot of the different concepts regarding environmental flows. So I'm going to give an overview of this framework that's currently being developed in tandem between these groups as well as with state and federal agencies. And this is ongoing work that started about a year and a half ago. So you've heard quite a bit that a lot of the reason that we talk about environmental flows, why we want to develop a framework, why we focus there first. Hydrology is an integrative driver of stream health. And so the idea of why we focus here is that if you can fix it, it's something we can manage and it will do a lot of help. But as you've also heard in the environmental seminar here that we talked about this week, there are other aspects that contribute to this. Flow is obviously not the only factor. Geomorphology matters, water quality matters. There's a lot of issues, but we typically do tend to start here first as the thing that's most easy to manage. And so statewide then, as you guys have heard about, there's a whole variety of different in-stream flow standards that different agencies have to protect. They often contradict each other. We have protections for water quality that need to happen, protections for endangered species, protections for the environment. And this is happening across the state, multiple different levels, multiple different agencies. We have to have the ability to assess the vulnerability of streams to the future stream flow conditions. The drought was a perfect example, as Ted just talked about. Situations come up and it's, where do we want to send that water? How do we want to balance the water and allocate it to different locations? And these are statewide needs across the state, right? And furthermore, then, how do we make these decisions? So we've talked about a lot of options during the course of this seminar, and there's a need then to figure out how to get these pieces together. So there's a lot of work to be done that will continue to be done in the next decades and probably forever. But how do we go about starting that? Some of the issues that you've heard about over the course of the seminar have varied. So we have issues from salmon protection all the way up near Shasta, down in Southern California. There's, we heard a little bit about some of the runoff and wanting to recycle runoff from wastewater treatment plants and the need to deal with that. In the Central Valley, we have diversions for irrigation. So we have multiple different problems in multiple different locations around the state that all fundamentally are asking similar questions, yet different questions for their various management actions and applications. And as you guys have probably come to the conclusion, this is really difficult at a statewide level. It's a lot easier to bring a group of folks together locally and say, here's our local issue, how do we want to deal with it locally? But the methods and the opportunities and things that they might come up with then may or may not be applicable elsewhere. But if I'm a state agency or a federal agency, how do I approach all these different myriad problems in a sort of unified way that provides consistency across the state, particularly because California is so diverse from north to south. And it's hard, frankly, to balance environmental flow needs with these other demands that we've been hearing about over the course of the quarter. And so there's really no mechanism in place to take a statewide uniform look at how we manage flows across the state. You've heard about a couple of the case examples where we have a watershed basis, Trinity River program, for example. We talked about Poudre Creek and the Poudre Creek Accord. And so there were local watershed-based efforts, but there's not anything comprehensive across the state to provide guidance on how to begin to approach these problems in a really unified way that uses the best available science. And so there really is a need statewide to develop a more coordinated framework that takes this suite of knowledge and addresses the problems that we've been hearing about. And so these are some of the challenges that we face now and probably will continue to face into the future. So the idea behind developing a statewide environmental flows framework really is about bringing together these disparate pieces of knowledge that we have and the science that we have to bear to really try to help integrate and solve some of these questions that are diverse across the state. So what we're sort of proposing conceptually from a framework perspective is that we have information on hydrology, and there's going to be particular data that we want to gather on that hydrology. There's information on ecology and biology, and together those, as we know, can be your first step towards setting environmental flow targets. There's a couple different ways you can go about doing that. We've talked about different methods during the course of this seminar, but ultimately then you want to have that base of knowledge and data, bring that together to set environmental flow targets, go through a process where you're balancing the beneficial uses and thinking about the different water availability and demands and limitations on the system before you come up with something that's an implementation structure. So this is not rocket science. This is something that has been published in different frameworks and things like the Aloha framework that we've talked about. But it does tend to get sort of lost when you sit down and actually try to do this in paper. And so it's useful to come back to this to really say, hey, let's use these approaches as we start to address a problem on a statewide level. So the folks that you saw in the initial slide, some of the technical folks here at Davis and Berkeley, have started working on some of these problems, in particular focusing on the first three boxes about taking hydrology data, geomorphology data, taking ecology data, and really comprehensively trying to look at how to develop, how could you use that data to start to come up with some of these environmental flow targets in a scientifically based way. So the idea that we came up with was more of a tiered approach. And so we're proposing basically a two-tiered approach. The first tier would be a coarse scale set of flow targets that would be applicable across the entire state. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. You could use those coarse tier one, what we're calling, or coarse first tier flow targets to provide the initial framework, the initial baseline for where you would want to start setting your flows, and then use that information to locally then start to assess in more detail some of the site-specific considerations that you would want to take into account to refine those environmental flows. And then lastly, the biggest and perhaps one of the largest pieces about this is there's a lot of work that's being done across the state that you've heard about, but it's not in a place that's publicly accessible. And so one of the other things that we're recommending is that there needs to be a statewide website, an environmental flows website that provides data, it's open, it's available to anybody, and can provide a place to bring together these studies and data across the state so that everybody has access to the same information. So this two-tiered approach, I'm going to talk a little bit more. So STEP is California Environmental Flows Framework. We needed an acronym, so we'll go with that one. And like I said, the first tier then is a statewide rapid approach for setting flow criteria. So it's statewide and comprehensive, but it's coarse scale. It can be done rapidly, and it can provide a baseline set of reference hydrology conditions based on a functional flows approach, which I'll talk a little bit more about, that sort of gives that, kind of brings everybody together into a rough, onto the same page, onto the same table. A sort of course set of initial flow targets that you could then start negotiating from with more detailed environmental flow methodologies that we've talked about earlier in the quarter. So the way that we went about developing these statewide coarse tier flow recommendations was to define a natural stream classification. From that, and I'm going to talk through each of these steps, from that, you look at the reference hydrology for each of these stream classes across the state, estimate a series of functional flow metrics, which is based on that functional flows approach, which I'll describe. And once you then predict those flow metrics at all the stream segments in the state, that provides a range of reference conditions that you can use as an initial coarse scale target. And I'll walk through an example of exactly how we're starting to do that. That then does give you a set of environmental flow targets that you could use. In many cases, this may not be appropriate for your particular watershed or stream reach of interest. So you might then want to move down into a tier 2 approach where you're doing a more specific environmental flow methodology to refine those targets. You might, for example, have a lot of implementation, or infrastructure below dams that you have to account for. There could be a limited amount of water available. And all of these considerations then would go into an evaluation framework that would then refine those initial flow targets. But the ultimate goal is to come up with a set of environmental flow recommendations that are based on sound science. Everybody is it's an open process, a transparent process, where all the stakeholders together in the group then have understood how you arrived at that conclusion. as you've heard previously in the quarter, you do get a lot of times where stakeholders come together into a room and are basically using their different environmental flow methodologies to argue for their various different water allocations. So one idea is to sort of put everybody together into the same framework to help guide into a negotiated set of flow recommendations. Okay, so make sure this comes up right. So with the Tier 1 approach, this is how we're coming up with this core scale set of flow recommendations for the state is based on a stream classification that Sam and some of the other folks in LAWR have worked on. They basically use the NHD plus layer, looked at catchment properties, climate patterns, geology, and soil properties to come up with a classification system of 9 classes across the state. What brought this group together in the first place was that there was a group down in Southern California that was essentially doing a similar set of developing a stream classification for the state. And interestingly, the two groups came up with roughly 80% similar stream classifications. So there was a process to go through and reconcile those two. And so, for example, the map that you're looking at here is really a reconciled stream classification between what the UC Davis group did and what the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project group did. But what this does then is provide a core scale look at the entire state, the patterns of flow regimes across the state, and help give you a sense of what type of flow patterns naturally occur that I then would want to consider if I was looking at reference flow conditions or natural flow regime conditions across the state. So, for example then, here's a series of hydrographs that we're terming dimensionless reference hydrographs. Each one of these groups of hydrographs is for one type of snow class. So, for example, in the upper left corner, you see low volume snowmelt and rain. That would be the streams that are typically occurring on the mid elevations of the Sierra Nevada. These are streams that receive rain on top of snow events. So you'll see in the hydrograph there's big winter storms in the wintertime, snowmelt pulse and snowmelt recession down to low flows in the winter. Conversely, there's a snowmelt stream class, which is the high elevation Sierras. That's the lower left box. And you can see there that the hydrology of these streams is really driven by snowmelt. We have a big snowmelt pulse in spring after the snow melts. And so these provide different reference patterns for the type of natural hydrology we would expect in each of those different stream classes. What you're seeing then is a compilation of a series of gauges. So the red line is the median daily flow, where the daily flow is the median daily flow at all of the gauges divided by the daily flow divided by the mean annual flow as at each of the reference gauges. And so that the blue lines are representing the different percentiles, 25th percentile, 75th percentile, 10th, and 90th. And so it's giving you that sense of variability along with the median pattern. And these then help give us a perspective and an idea of what the natural flow regimes would look like in each of these stream classes. Okay. So then using this information and taking the idea of a functional flows approach, which Ted touched on, we can start to pick out the components of the hydrograph that we think are most relevant for ecological processes. So the functional flows approach, the idea is that we want to focus on the aspects of the flow regime that have the highest tie to ecologic, geomorphic, or biogeochemical functions. So for example, as Ted mentioned, in most managed systems, you're not going to be able to produce the entire natural flow regime, but there are certain aspects of that flow regime that are most closely tied to the functioning of stream systems. And we want to focus in on those particular components as the pieces of the hydrograph that we most like to preserve within a system. Additionally, we want to take into account the geomorphic setting and the channel floodplain dynamics. As we sort of talked about earlier in the seminar, if I put a big flood pulse down a river, but it doesn't access the floodplain, that flood pulse may be less effective at actually doing the ecological work that we want it to do. So it's important to consider both the flows and how much flow and when I'm putting the flow down, as well as the geomorphic setting that they're going down. So here's an example of a functional flow type hydrograph, similar to what Ted showed earlier. So the idea is that in this mixed rain snowmelt system, or a low volume snowmelt type of stream class, I might want to preserve that fall flush flow, that first initial wet season initiation flow. I might want to preserve a peak winter flow that does a lot of geomorphic work. The spring recession has a lot of ecological benefit to it in terms of timing of reproduction for species, outmigration for salmon. And I might want to maintain some sort of dry season base flow. So I'm not preserving the whole entire natural hydrograph, but I'm preserving or restoring particular components that I think have, that the literature tells us have a lot of functionality in these different systems. And so how do we actually put this into practice? So Ted talked about how you could go through and come up with a water budget based on this for each of these different flow components. And we can also quantify each of these different flow components using a series of flow metrics. So each of these boxes then might represent each of those flow components. And I can look at the magnitude, how big is that box? I can look at the timing, where the box is located in time. I can look at the duration of that box, how wide is that box? And this provides a way to have quantifiable flow metrics that characterize those functional flow components. So if we take all of that information and synthesize it together, here's an example of kind of how we're coming up then with recommended core scale flow metrics or flow targets for each of the streams. So we start with the stream classification, from which we get a series of reference hydrographs that are applicable for that type of stream class. From those reference hydrographs then, we can pick out those functional flow components that we just talked about and use those boxes or quantify from the gauge data the range in metrics. So what is the range of magnitude and timing of that winter high flow? What is the range and the rate of change of the spring snowmelt recession? And use that information from each of these stream classes to then come up with a set of metrics that then provide us guidance on what types of flow targets we might then want to be shooting for in an environmental flow regime. And so the idea behind this Tier 1 approach is that ultimately you would be able to, for example, click on a map, say, here's my stream, it's located in this area, I fall under this stream class, I'm interested in, when I pull out the scaled reference data for the flow data, I get this set of ranges for my flow metrics, and that provides me a rough target to shoot for in my initial flow recommendations. So currently, this is ongoing, and some of the products that are going to be coming out of this are the stream classification that's actually done. It's up on one of the websites, the Water Quality Monitoring Council, mywaterquality.data.gov, I think is the website, that's out there and available. We've worked on developing these dimensionless reference hydrographs that describe the patterns and variability within the flows for each of the stream classes. We're currently in the process of looking at calculating functional flow metrics, these metrics that describe the functional flow components for each of the reference gauges and ultimately for each of the stream classes in the state, and working on the process of how then to model and scale those flow metrics to each of the NHD scale segments in the state. And the idea is that then this will provide a rough cut course recommendation for flow targets for across the entire state. So as you come down then, so that might suit your needs if I have a stream of interest that I want to be able to get these course scale flow recommendations for, that might be suitable, I might be okay with that, or I might say, you know what, that's still going to cost me too much water, I have too many constraints on my system, I need to have additional information. So what we'd then like to do in this environmental flow framework is simply provide guidance on the type of environmental flow methodologies that you could use and the different type of considerations one would take into account to then make that more refined determination of how to scale those course scale flow targets down into a more refined flow target. And that would happen in this Tier 2 process. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. There we go. So as you guys have heard during this quarter, there's a lot of different technical approaches to really get more detailed, refined environmental flow. We've talked a little bit about Aloha during the quarter. There's these statistical scaling methods where you scale the natural flow regime. There's this idea of the functional flow components. Each of these is a different way and might provide a slightly different set of environmental flow recommendations. So how do you go about choosing? So what we have started setting up in this Tier 2 framework is guidance for how to consider this. The first step that you want to do is consider your context and objectives for your particular watershed or system. And consideration needs to include are there ecological endpoints you're shooting for? Do we care about salmon in this stream or not? Do we care about general native species communities? What's the spatial and temporal scale we're considering? What are the natural hydrologic conditions and water management systems? Do I have a system that I'm shooting for reference flow conditions, or no, I'm in a highly managed system? I'm going to be looking for some sort of compromise based on my water infrastructure and water rights setup. You go through a process of characterizing the data. And again, this is what we're simply proposing is guidance on how to do this, or just make sure that when you're doing it, do it this way. And there's a lot of considerations there about the type of data that you want to make sure that you had and gathered and compiled. And then guidance on the selection of an environmental flow method then that meets your needs and objectives. So there are a bunch of different environmental flow methodologies out there, and they each have their pros and cons. And so for your particular management objectives and your spatial scale, some of these methods might be more or less useful for you. And it's helpful to consider that and have all of that information in one place so that collectively a stakeholder group or a group of agencies can come together to decide about what environmental flow method they want to pursue, rather than one group doing one method and one group doing another method and then arguing over the results, right? And then from there, once you sort of have gone through your process of coming up with more refined flow recommendations, you do have to consider the policy management needs. There probably will be, maybe you need to do optimization modeling because you need to take into account, you know, water for agriculture, water for the environment, water for water supply, for consumption. There's going to be different stakeholders that are going to be involved and agency-specific requirements, a lot of which we've talked about and touched on over the course of this seminar. Ultimately, that then helps bring you to some refined flow criteria that perhaps may be more specific and more tailored, hopefully, to your particular system. And then finally, you do have to go through an implementation plan. I think, as we heard last week, one of the biggest things we don't do is monitor on a long-term basis. Did your flow regime actually work? Does it do and achieve the management goals that you wanted to? And so, again, we're just sort of wanting to highlight that there are things you can do for adaptive management. Monitoring is important. Otherwise, how are you going to know if what you're doing is correct? And so this sort of gives you a sense of the framework in general, kind of what we're proposing. The goal is, by the time we sort of work through this, some of the products that are going to come out of this is a better baseline characterization of hydrologic alteration across the state. That's one of the things we're going to be working on. A more comprehensive look at ecological endpoints in different parts of the state. A lot of times we tend to focus on salmon, like strictly, but there could be other ecological needs that are important. We're going to be looking a little bit more closely at some of these flow ecology relationships. Do some more regional classification for hydrogeomorphology as well as just statewide. And ultimately, the idea is that this will be produced into a guidance document that will come out onto the website. And again, I sort of mentioned, here's the slide that talks about what the website will be. It'll be on the part of the California Water Quality Monitoring Council and my water quality website. And the goal is to have all of this information available for any of the state agencies to use. And so with that, I'll go ahead and finish up, but I just wanted to give a broad overview of a process that a group of folks are working on to try to help move environmental flow discussions and environmental flow science forward in a more open and transparent and informative way for the state. So with that, I'll finish up, and if there's any other questions from you for today, I'm happy to take those. Thanks. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned the recommendation for having data available online. That's what this site's about, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Why create it? What's the difference in the environmental flows data versus just the flow data?
Right, so I think the vision behind developing a more comprehensive environmental flows website, there is gauge data that's out there, but typically, you know, it's going to be the CDAC gauges, right? And so you could potentially include, you know, try to include some of the other agency data that we know is out there, some of the, you know, water agency data. But I think this is more about what are the studies that are out there? What are the different flow methods that are out there? How somebody did a case study, what did they find? Remember we had a discussion with TwoTiered folks. They've been monitoring their flows for 15 years, and they produced a lot of white papers, but not a lot of published papers. And it's kind of buried in the website. What if we have links on a more statewide site that can point you to that? So, you know, at least for me personally, I see a lot of this as really just an educational information gathering exercise to just put a lot of the great data that's out there into an accessible format in one place. And so it's not 100% about just having flow data, but you can have links to the stream classification, you can have links to the biologic data. There's CNCI data out there across the state, which is the California Stream Condition Index data. And kind of just helping on the website that organizes where to go to find these different pieces and why those different pieces are important for consideration. I guess that's kind of at least how I'm envisioning it.
The data is broader than just, you know, live data.
Yeah, yeah. So you can have a link to see that and be like, hey, you want live emissions data, go here. You know, so it's more of a clearinghouse, you know, maybe might be another term.
Yeah. You mentioned the various endpoints and all. There is. You just mentioned also the condition index indices. So that seems like a good first cut, right? That's what we want to try to improve or optimize for.
Yeah, and so you've totally hit on one of the things that we want to do. When I sort of really quickly skim through the quote-unquote tier 2 products, part of what this larger collaborative group is doing is it's putting together the guidance framework that ultimately will come up on the website, but there's also some smaller technical questions and issues that we're addressing different groups of folks within this larger collaborative that are working on. And that's one of them exactly, is to look at the statewide gauge data and the reference gauge data and compare that in a more comprehensive way to the CSCI data. There's a lot of work that's been done on linking flow ecology relationships, but you know, what happens if you start to look at that at a statewide scale that actually hasn't really been done yet? So that's one of the things we'll be starting on this summer. Because there's some really rich data out there that's sort of taking this comprehensive state view. It's difficult, and it hasn't happened before, but so it's partly why this collaborative of like 14 folks, right, have sort of come together to start trying to tackle some of these issues. Exactly. Any other questions? Any other questions for Ted? Oh, you want to take it?
This question for all three of you that worked on this for a few years now. What would be the lessons that you learned in California, or say the Western U.S. or the country on environmental and the technical side and the policy side? How to bring it together?
All right, I'll go first, but then Ted and Sam should weigh in too with their thoughts. I think for me, it's that it is genuinely complicated, and there's a lot of good effort and intent, and it's really difficult to attach the science to the policy. And the interpretation of taking scientific concepts and scientific data and terming it in a way that makes it implementable is a challenge. And so you have the science folks who might really understand the pieces and understand the technical side of it, and you have the policy folks who really understand what you can and cannot do and how to implement it, and sometimes the communication between the two can be really difficult. And so for me, it's, you know, it takes time. It takes time for those groups of people to work together, and we had a seminar on the FERC process, right, a couple of weeks ago, and I think that was one of the big things I learned from there, is that over time, as these folks work together, they learn to talk together. And there's a lot of value in having educated stakeholders come together more often, right? So I think we heard that from some of our panelists. Some of those folks have been working together for 10 years, and they've learned how to talk to each other from their different backgrounds. And that is what has been one of the big things that's helped make stuff go forward. So, do you want to ask questions?
The proximity of some of these technical policy areas, it seems like Davis is well situated in Sacramento.
Why, yes, it is. I would totally agree. Yeah, the Center for Watershed Sciences, for sure. That's it. That is exactly. Ted, do you want to?
No, I mean, just to add on that, we just had a recent water quality. We had our first sort of environmental flows meeting with all of the agencies that are interested in this project. We realized that it's actually coming up with common terminology, which is like a central first step. And I mean, that's sort of became one of the top tasks of our next agenda. You know, will be to try to develop a common understanding, because for each institution, each agency, or within each program area, they have a certain lexicon that relate to the specific policies that they're responsible for enforcing. And the terms they use might be very similar to the terms that are used in other contexts. When we start talking holistically about statewide issues, confusion reigns. So I think, you know, if we do nothing else, if we make no progress on the science, I think I'm fairly confident we will make some progress on at least developing a common language, which I think will go a long way.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a great point. Do you want to add something?
If you go back to the hydrologic, the stream flow class. So technically, what I was trying to do, technically, there is a fine line between how fine you want to get the details in each stream, and at the same time, how not going too much in fine details, not you get lost. And at the beginning, when I was thinking of this, the state and the other places, like, hey, imagine to model stream flow reaches every 500 meters, 1,500 feet of every reach of California during the rainfall runoff, hydraulic modeling, and then hydraulic modeling interaction. Then you start thinking that, yeah, that's possible, and then start. So the point here, or the lesson that I learned, is that there are good capacities, good technical capacities that we can bring to the table to make it happen. Not necessarily that you want to model every part. We decided to start putting everything into boxes, into classes or categories. And that started making the problem a little bit more simple. So you don't have, I don't know, 5,000 miles, 6,000 miles of bridges. You have now 9 different classes, now different figures that you want to analyze. And the same with geomorphology, and then we're going to stratify by ecology. So the take home message, something that I learned is that it's possible. And that there is the science and the computer. And then on the policy side, I think it's so you want to find a lot. Policy is kind of you need to pass a light through different windows. You have the policy window, the social window, the economic window, and you want to pass a policy through that one. Sometimes they align, sometimes they don't. And that one, I think right now we have a good alignment of some of these, the interests, the state interest, the political interest, the social interest. Being ready, I think in that one was being ready and be able to listen, to talk to each other. So you can be like, oh, now I get it. A lot of this is, sometimes it can be big pictures, sometimes it can be small details, just to learn how to understand those. The other one, sorry, last one. Oh, the jargon, man, the jargon and the every word, for every agency, for every scientist, for multiple disciplines, it's just done. And I think that's the other one that I learned, to make sure to take the time to say, hey, when you say flow criteria, were you referring to this or to that? What is the difference between flow criteria, flow objective, and flow target, and environmental flow? Or are they the same? Are they different? How they are? And then all of a sudden you start becoming, do we have flow components? Do we have flow metrics? What are the different flow metrics within us? So all of those, taking the time to listen to the other guys, multidisciplinary space, is worth it. It takes a lot of time and a lot of faith.
Any other questions? Sure. Go for it, Jay.
Sure, the people like
Well, yeah, we don't know yet. I feel like we've been working together for a few years, but we're sort of just getting started. I think we're proceeding, sort of as fast as we can, but I think there's a rich history of scientists developing decision support tools. That do not support decisions, that sit on the shelf, and as clever as they are, and they may go for a lot of different reasons. They may fail because they either don't address the problem that are the real or the most pressing problems that decision makers are facing. They may be technically complex, or they may just not. The timing may not be right. And so I feel like with this group and with this effort, we're trying to sort of learn from that history and really do the legwork on the front end of understanding agency culture, agency policies, agency needs, and to really have our science and our products be responsive to those, so that these products and the science is truly helpful and integrated in the way decisions are made down the road. I'd say the outcome is sort of TBD.
Windows an opportunity to come and go, and whoever has to last longer.
Yeah.
The,
Fortunately, none of us are too close to retirement, or unfortunately, so we'll be around for a while.
I think a key added that they mentioned is being responsive to the agency. Because sometimes we just do things because they are cool, and that's fine. I mean, that's curiosity. We are scientists, that's okay. But in some of these things, if you want to make it to the next level, it has to be responsive. And that one is not easy because either you do not know it, someone else know it, how to put other people together.
One of my worries is that just responding to the agencies is not a recipe for success here.
Yeah.
Because part of the at least half the problem is the agencies don't know what they want. Give them what they need, they wouldn't know how to use it. So it's a long process, not only because it takes a long time to do the technical work, but for them to figure out how to make good use of it, the politics will work out there. So it's going to be a long time.
If I was in fact going to use decision makers, most of them, they do not know what they want until they see it. And a couple of those products that you're seeing there, they didn't know that they wanted it until they saw it and they were like, oh yeah, something like that.
And then 2 months later, I want something.
Yeah.
And you want to get out ahead of that. And that's, I think, where a lot of your effort is going to lead to. Here's what we've got for you now, but you got to sort of try to stay ahead of it, which is really hard.
The part that is ahead, I think, is what Sarah came with about all the groups that Sarah taking the lead. Tier number 2. I think that one, how it's outlined to try to, again, organize, set everything so you can, again, go ahead. I think that's
It's a good idea. We'll see if we can.
it's a good start.
It's a good start. We'll see if we can deliver.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Oh, another thing,